There's a kind of silence out west that doesn't just hush your voice, it hushes the ache in your chest. A silence not empty, but sacred. One that stretches across miles of golden grass and red canyon stone echoing not just with wind, but with the lives of those who came here to start over. Eleanor Whitmore was one of them. Back east, she was told she had everything: porcelain skin, polished posture lineage that stretched back to the Mayflower. But no one ever asked her what she wanted. They told her whom to smile at, how to cross her ankles, and which suitor would be best for her father's bank account. At age 51, the last proposal she received was from a widower twice her age who collected orchids and wives. So she ran. She answered an ad. A rancher in the Montana Territory, widowed, said he wanted a partner, not a doll, promised nothing more than a roof of fire and an honest life. His name was Wesley Hart, and the photograph he sent, well, it made her blush. But the man who met her off the stagecoach wasn't the man in the photo. He was broader, rougher, eyes like ironwood, not honey. He said little, did less to comfort. He offered her a hand down from the wagon, then walked off without a word. The ranch, not the sprawling estate she'd imagined. It was held together by time, rust, and hope. And the children, 3 of them, not his, not hers, just left behind. Eleanor stood there in her fine travel boots, dust settling on her hem, staring at a life she didn't understand. A man she couldn't read, a home that wasn't warm, and she thought, had I made a mistake? But sometimes what we call disappointment is only the first step towards something real. And real things, they take time, especially love. Eleanor Whitmore had spent most of her 51 years walking on polished floors and speaking in measured tones. Her corsets were tight, her hair immaculate, her opinions muted by generations of proper breeding. But what no one in the drawing rooms of Charleston saw, what no mirror could reflect, was the hollowness blooming inside her. A widow not by death but by dismissal, Eleanor had long been a quiet fixture in her family's manor. Her husband had abandoned her for a younger woman a decade ago, leaving behind a shell of a marriage and a reputation no woman could easily repair. The Whitmore name ensured she wouldn't starve, but it could not ensure she would be loved. So when Eleanor first read the advertisement, "Rancher seeks companion not for her youth but her ability to keep a home and a steady heart," her fingers trembled. She read it again by candlelight, her nightgown billowing around her, as if asking, "What do you have left to lose?" His name was Wesley Grant, a rancher in Montana, 47, widowed, owner of modest land and 7 horses. Said he didn't mind age or past, just wanted someone who wouldn't run when things got hard. They wrote letters for months, slow, deliberate pages carried on trains and dusted with the scent of ink and dreams. He wrote of wide skies of colts born in spring. She wrote of loneliness and lemon bread, of her love for reading aloud when the house was quiet. He never mentioned looks. She never offered a portrait. And still something about his words, their gentleness, their grit, called to her in a way lace and pearls never had. Maybe it was foolish. But foolishness, Eleanor thought, might be the first breath of freedom. One morning before the sun had fully climbed the columns of the manor porch, Eleanor climbed aboard a train westward. Her family did not stop her. Some said nothing. Some said too much. The train rocked like a cradle beneath her. She carried 1 trunk, 3 dresses, a small Bible, and every letter Wesley had written, each folded and tied with a blue ribbon. She arrived in the town of Stillwater 2 weeks later. A vast golden plain stretched before her. She held her breath, but Wesley was not there. Instead, a young stable boy met her at the platform holding a crumpled note. "Miss Whitmore, I'm delayed at the ranch. The road washed out from the rains. Take the wagon with Jeb. He'll bring you to the house. W. Grant." She tried not to feel the weight of disappointment. She told herself it was weather, not rejection. But when the wagon reached the ranch hours later, the house wasn't what she expected either. Not whitewashed and tidy like the letters. It leaned to one side, tired from the wind. There was no flower garden, no porch swing, just dry earth, a lonely wind, and hoof prints scattered across the yard. And Wesley still missing. But someone had left water warming on the stove and a single plate on the table, like they'd been expecting her after all. What kind of man invites a bride across the country and leaves an empty home waiting? Eleanor had walked away from high society expecting hardship. But this felt like something else entirely. The wind had changed by morning. Eleanor sat on the porch steps wrapped in her shawl, cradling a tin mug of weak coffee. The sunrise spilled honey across the field, and for a moment the ache in her chest softened. She had arrived expecting a man with open arms, and found instead an echoing house. She had expected a porch swing, flowers, perhaps even a smile. But what she'd found was quiet and emptiness, and yet someone had boiled water. Someone had left a fire going. That meant something, didn't it? She heard the horse before she saw the man. The hooves were uneven, not galloping, but pacing, slow and steady like a man returning home after a long, uncertain journey. Eleanor stood, the mug trembling in her hand. Her heart picked up speed, unsure if it was hope or fear pressing against her ribs. He appeared as the sun kissed the fence line. A tall silhouette slumped in the saddle. His shirt clung to him, damp from work or rain, and his face, sun-worn and quiet, looked nothing like the photograph she'd imagined. He was younger, or maybe just harder. He didn't smile, didn't even tip his hat. Instead, he dismounted stiffly and walked toward her like he hadn't expected to find anyone waiting. His eyes landed on her trunk by the door, on the laced boots she wore, on the way her hands clutched her shawl. "Eleanor?" he asked, voice deep, cautious. She nodded. "I thought you weren't coming," he muttered. "After the storm, I figured the train might have turned back." "I came anyway," she said, more steady than she felt. He looked at her again. Not rudely, not with judgment. Just long enough that it felt like he was measuring something beyond appearance. Maybe her resolve, maybe her weariness. "Storm took out the South Road. Took me 2 days to get the cattle back. That's why I wasn't there." "I understand," she said gently. "I waited." His gaze dropped. Not ashamed, just tired. "I didn't expect you to look like this." It wasn't cruel, just honest. Eleanor felt the old ache stir, that constant tension between being seen and being judged. But she didn't flinch. "And what did you expect?" she asked, quiet as morning frost. Wesley shifted his weight, looked out toward the horizon. "Someone younger, I guess," he said. But then again, someone who wouldn't have waited in that house alone for 2 nights. Silence settled between them. Then almost shyly he added, "Thank you for not leaving." Eleanor looked at the land behind him, dusty, harsh, vast. There were no chandeliers here, no drawing rooms, just this broken man with weathered hands and something unspoken in his eyes. "I didn't come here for perfection," she replied. Wesley took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair. "No," he said slowly. "But maybe you came to the wrong place anyway." Eleanor straightened her shoulders, chin lifting, with the dignity no scandal had ever taken from her. "I came to be useful," she said, "to help someone who wanted company, not decoration." He looked at her then, not past her, not through her, but truly at her. "Then maybe you're in the right place after all," he said. That afternoon he showed her the barn. It was half collapsed at one side roof, still sagging from the last snowstorm. Chickens wandered freely, and the garden was mostly weeds. She didn't flinch. She asked where the wash line was. She asked what he needed help with first. Wesley answered with short sentences and long pauses. Like he wasn't used to speaking, or maybe not used to being heard. But by nightfall she had made biscuits. They were dense, a little too salty. He ate 3. "You don't have to cook," he said. "I want to." And then, without meaning to, she smiled. Not a practiced Charleston smile, but one that came from being needed, however imperfectly. Wesley didn't smile back, but his eyes softened. And for Eleanor, that was enough. She had fled society in search of freedom, but what she found was a man afraid to be loved. Could 2 people broken in different ways still build something whole? The days that followed were stitched together with small efforts and quieter disappointments. Eleanor rose with the sun, her back stiff from the thin mattress, and her hands raw from hauling buckets of well water. She scrubbed the old stove top until it gleamed, hung laundry in a line of uneven breezes, and mended shirts with patches that didn't quite match. And Wesley, he was kind in the way that trees are kind, steady, solid, and utterly silent. He thanked her with nods and short glances, but never once reached for the chair across from her after supper. Never asked where she came from, never offered more than what the day demanded. Eleanor wasn't lonely, at least not in the way she had once been at candlelit tables in Charleston, with men who smiled at her and whispered about her behind gloves. But she was unseen. Again. Just like before. At night, she sat on the edge of the porch, fingers wrapped around a cup of tea she brewed from dried mint she'd found behind the barn. Wesley passed her on his way to the barn lantern, swinging. "You don't have to fix everything," he murmured one night, surprising her. She looked up, blinking. "I'm not." He paused. "Yes, you are." The words weren't cruel. They were full of something heavier, like sorrow softened by time. "I just wanted to help," she whispered. Wesley looked at the fields, the house, the fence half hanging like a broken arm. "I didn't send for you," he said. The sentence cracked like dry wood in firelight. Eleanor swallowed. "You wrote the letters." "My sister did." Eleanor's hands shook slightly. She held the cup tighter. "Did you even want a wife?" He didn't answer right away. The lantern flickered between them. "I wanted quiet," he finally said. "I wanted to keep my head down and not owe anyone anything anymore." She nodded. It hurt. Not because he didn't want her, but because she knew exactly how that felt. "I've lived most of my life in rooms filled with words I couldn't trust," she said softly. This house, this dust, this silence, it isn't what I expected. But I didn't come here because of letters." He turned toward her. Then why Eleanor lifted her chin. "Because I was tired of being chosen for the wrong reasons. And I thought maybe out here I could choose something too." They didn't speak for a while. The stars blinked on one by one as if listening. Finally, Wesley said, "You still can." He didn't elaborate, just walked toward the barn, leaving her there, eyes stinging with something old and new. She hadn't come for love, but perhaps quietly she had hoped for it anyway. He hadn't sent for her, but she stayed. Was loyalty enough to build a life on when love had not yet spoken its name? Eleanor didn't leave. Maybe she should have. Maybe a younger version of her, the one who still cared about lace gloves and dinner party glances, would have packed her carpet bag and caught the next westbound wagon. But this version of Eleanor, she stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she'd never felt more honest. The letters may have been written by Wesley's sister, but the days that followed were hers. The bread she baked, the hem she mended, the dirt she brushed from the porch step that was hers. She planted a garden. Wesley didn't stop her, just watched from the fence, arms crossed, as she tore weeds from a forgotten plot by the back shed. "Too dry," he said once. Eleanor looked up from the parched ground and smiled. "Then I'll bring water." She did bucket by bucket. Lettuce, beans, a few carrots. Nothing fancy, but life blooming under her hands. Wesley began to linger longer at meals. One morning she found a fresh-cut bundle of wildflowers on the table. No note. Just left there like an apology too shy for words. "You didn't need to do this," she said that evening, gently holding the petals between her fingers. He stared at the ground, then lifted his gaze. "You make things grow, even things that shouldn't." A breeze stirred between them. Eleanor's breath caught not from romance, but from something better. Respect. That week he showed her how to saddle his gentlest horse. "You said you never rode before," he explained, guiding her foot into the stirrup. "I said I never had the chance," she corrected. They rode in silence, her skirts bunching awkwardly. His hat pulled low, but the silence was different now. Not distance, just peace. That night, Wesley knocked gently on her doorframe. "I found something of my sister's you might like." He handed her a book, dog-eared, pages faded. Emily Dickinson, the poem she'd once whispered in the quiet of her boarding school window. "Thank you," she said, voice soft. "I didn't mean to shut you out," he said suddenly, hands fidgeting. "I didn't mean to barge in," she answered. He gave a dry laugh. "Maybe it was good for both of us." And it was. The air between them didn't crackle with passion. It softened with trust. A slow thaw. Love hadn't come with fireworks. It came with carrots and wildflowers and dusty poems passed like lanterns in the dark. They weren't strangers anymore. But were they something more? Or just two quiet lives sharing shelter from the same wind? The house had grown quieter, not with coldness, but with a certain reverence. Like two people were finally breathing at the same pace, learning the shape of one another's silence. Wesley no longer retreated after supper. He stayed sometimes reading aloud from the old book he'd given her, sometimes just sitting long legs stretched out across the parlor floor. Eleanor began knitting again, an old habit, soft and steady. Their evenings were wordless lullabies, but nothing had been spoken aloud. Not the kind of words that mattered. And when news came from town, it broke through that peace like thunder across prairie stillness. Wesley had once been engaged, not just to any girl, but the daughter of the town's mayor. Beautiful, polished, with a voice like clinking glass. She left him the moment his father lost the land, the storekeeper whispered as he wrapped Eleanor's sugar in brown paper. Didn't want a poor man. Eleanor smiled, polite as ever, but something broke inside. She didn't ask Wesley about it that night, or the next, but it changed how she looked at him. Was she just a placeholder? Someone who didn't ask for much? Someone to keep the garden growing? While he mourned a woman with softer hands and finer ways, he noticed the change. Of course he did. "You're quieter," he said one morning. She shrugged. "Just tired." "You're not a good liar, Eleanor." She set her tea down carefully. "Then tell me something true, Wesley. Something that isn't about fences or beans or weather." He sat across from her, looking like a man who'd rather face a wild horse than the weight of his own heart. "I thought I needed someone perfect," he said finally. "I thought love was supposed to be easy, graceful. But it isn't. Not when it's real." Her voice was barely a whisper. "And me? What am I?" "You're real," he said, eyes steady. "And you stayed." The ache in her chest didn't vanish, but it softened. Still, she needed space. She rode out alone the next day past the ridge where the sun hit the valley just right. She thought about Boston, about her sister's polished smiles, about the men who only loved her when she was quiet, small, convenient. And then she thought about Wesley and the quiet ways he'd chosen her, the book, the horse, the extra nail in the garden gate. Was that enough? Maybe the better question was, had she let herself believe she was worth more? Sometimes the hardest part isn't being unloved. It's realizing you've never truly loved yourself. And now Eleanor stood at a crossroads alone beneath a burning sky. The trail dusted up behind Eleanor as she urged the mare forward, not in flight, but in thought. She didn't ride to escape, she rode to remember. The valley below rolled out like a soft quilt, stitched with cottonwoods and fence lines. The wind teased her bonnet loose. She didn't fix it. There beneath the whispering sky, she let herself feel everything. Every sorrow she'd tucked beneath a tight corset. Every disappointment brushed off with a polite smile. She thought of the women in Boston, graceful, delicate, and praised for it, and how they'd looked at her with pity when she chose a mail-order marriage over an advantageous match. And she thought of Wesley. She saw again how he'd waited by the porch light when her saddle had slipped, how he'd chopped firewood without being asked, how his voice had trembled when he said you stayed. He had never promised her poetry, but he had given her quiet room to be, and in a world that once measured her worth by waistlines and table manners, that was something sacred. By dusk, Eleanor turned the mare homeward, not because she had to, because she wanted to. When she arrived, Wesley was in the field, sleeves rolled, soil on his hands. He looked up, and for once he didn't smile. He ran, and she met him halfway. They didn't kiss, not yet, but they stood close, heart to heart, breath to breath. And when she finally whispered, "I needed to remember who I was," before all of it, he simply said, "I was waiting for her." Eleanor didn't know the exact moment the ranch began to feel like home. Maybe it was the morning she woke without dread. Maybe it was the first time she laughed, truly laughed, when Wesley spilled a pan of eggs and muttered, "Well, we can call it scrambled." Or maybe it was the sound of her name in the children's voices. They'd started coming around, neighboring kids, small boots thudding across the porch, shy faces peeking through the window. There was a comfort she hadn't known she could give just by being present, patient. She taught one of them to sew, another to read, and every once in a while she'd catch Wesley watching from the barn door, soft-eyed and leaning on the frame, like a man who still couldn't believe he was allowed such peace. There were still hard days. The well froze one morning. A cow miscarried. Winter crept up too fast. But through it all, they kept showing up for each other. One late afternoon, with the sun fading amber over the hills, Wesley brought her a locket. Inside was not a portrait, but a pressed daisy, the kind she'd once tucked behind her ear during spring branding. "You were wild," he said quietly, long before this place. But here, you're free. Eleanor clutched it to her chest, not out of sentiment, but out of something deeper: belonging. In the end, what mattered wasn't the size of her waist or the way others had once whispered behind her back. What mattered was the quiet steadiness of a man who saw her worth without needing to be told. A man who didn't flinch at her laughter or shame her appetite for life. What mattered was the warmth of a home they built together, slowly, gently, where judgment had no place and kindness did all the talking. For those who've ever been cast aside, maybe because of a scar, a limp, a number, or just being different, this story is a soft reminder someone out there will see what others missed. And sometimes love doesn't show up in grand declarations, but in the way someone stays. If this story brought something gentle to your day, we'd be honored if you'd subscribe to None, Wild West Saga. Your support helps us tell more stories that heal, especially for hearts that have weathered life's harder seasons. Leave a comment below. Would you like to see what happens next or hear more stories like this? We'd love to read your thoughts. And as always, thank you for being here. You matter.